very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and nice to see a lot of old friends again. Is this a church thing? Everybody stands at the back. I'm undergoing quite a learning experience these last few days, because there's an expectation when you've written a book that you know what to do at these events, and I really don't have the foggiest idea. So I would like to thank Peter and David and the outstanding staff of the Frontier Centre for Public Policy for inviting me here today to speak. And I'd like to thank all of you, obviously, for your interest, and many of you buying the book. I was just penning a newspaper column for tomorrow in Saskatchewan, and I was doing a little reflection on writing a book. It's an amazing thing. It's much like running a race. There's a marathon aspect to it. But it also really screws up your self-esteem. I've got a hide as thick as a rhino from doing a talk show. There's not much you can say to me or about me that's even going to slow me down. You put it all between the covers. And I said this, you turn in with Valley Girl inflection, finding yourself walking up to total strangers saying, "You liked it? Really? Really? Was it okay?" And other friends who have written books have told me they go through the same experience. It doesn't matter. There is something about the permanence, obviously not of just the written word, but the binding and the cover, that what you write is going to be here now for the long haul. I don't know where to begin with an audience like you, because I know many of you, and many of you are the sorts of people and the people who inspired this book. Evidently, I rant occasionally. Say it so. The introduction of the book actually sort of gives you a frame of how the book started. It was really a series of interconnected rants, and there were really two of them. Back in 2006, just as we were coming off that wondrous centennial, something had happened one day, and I was in the middle of, again, a very well-reasoned, balanced process of dialectic. And I was ranting about how it was our population had just hit 981,000. Lowest level since 1981-82. And we just celebrated this wondrous centennial. How it was that NDP spin doctors, and I had lunch with one, was selling me on this new visioning model for Saskatchewan infrastructure, that you really don't need much more than about 975,000 people in the province. And I was thinking, not only have the results of a certain form of public policy been paid back so many times, we now have an ethic and a structure that promotes and develops thinking small. Now that's the inner dialogue. The outer dialogue is just going, I wish somebody would write this down, as I ranted. And I had a few rants like that. So I would throw things occasionally in the file folder. 2008 was the rant that actually made me sit down and write the book. A high-ranking New Democrat who had been Roy Romano's triumvirate up to 1999, a guy named Mark Stobie, had moved to Winnipeg after the 99 near-death experience for the Romano government, and begun to work with Gary Dewar. Stobie, and again, many people who knew his wife Bev, it was a horrible thing. Bev was killed. In 2008, Mark Stobie, 8 years after the murder, was actually charged with having taken his wife's life. And I'm told by people, I didn't think I was this kind of guy, but my producers have told me and my wife's told me, so I guess I've got to accept that. I tend to get a little fixated on things. So one night I'm just getting ready to go to bed and I'm doing some show prep and I'm trying to get a court date for a first appearance for this guy. And every time Googling, Yahooing, whatever search engine I'm using, you put in the name Mark Stobie and the first few pages come up about a book he wrote in 1991. And it was called Divine Rule, A Decade of Hope and Hardship. Now, when Stobie wrote that book in 91, he was an employee of the NDP caucus office and won MLA. And it was basically a campaign tool used in the 91 election. And as I observe in the book, it was less a magnum opus than it was a hatchet job on the government way. It was a political campaign tool, as all it was. But I'm sitting there dark in my office, and everybody's asleep, and I keep thinking, the tentacles of a certain pervasiveness of politics in this province are so deep that 17 years later, the only official record of the divine government is a hatchet job by a bunch of U of R socialists, edited by the NDP Director of Research. So in the midst of this moment, I thought, how long is it going to be before someone, probably at the U of R, pens the definitive work on the Calvert government as a high watermark in the evolution of Saskatchewan? Because the consistent pattern has been, since 1944, that as each New Democrat government goes, whether it's Tommy McLeod, who was Tommy Douglas's confidant and Deputy Minister of Finance who wrote Road to Jerusalem, whether it is the collected works of Howard Leeson, out everybody for 2 years, we can go on and on. In fact, and I have a lot of fun at the expense of what I call the gatekeepers. Somebody would write a book. So I thought, well, I talked to a few people and they weren't interested, and I thought, okay, I guess maybe somebody should write this down. But there's not a lot of interest in the Calvert years, frankly, let's be clear. They were 7 years, longest hospital waiting lists in Canada, worst highways, biggest population decline since the 1960s. It's not that, but again, somebody at the U of R would find a way to immortalize that in print. In fact, and Howard Gleason did actually in 2 subsequent books. He had 2 collections out, one in 2000, one in 2007, about Saskatchewan politics. And the essays do talk about the wondrous transformation of Saskatchewan in the Calvert years. But I thought, maybe we're missing something more here. I'm really fortunate in that, and if I can find the piece, I'll actually read it. I should be better prepared than this. I do a lot of after-dinner speaking and convention speaking around Saskatchewan, where I talk about the Saskatchewan attitude. And it was really quite simple for me when I got back. I'd only been away for 6 years in Alberta. And those were 6 tough years in Alberta. You may remember the early 90s, very tough times. And I don't know if it was the sense of hope that permeates every single Albertan, or the sense of entitlement that every single Albertan is born with. But when I got back here, I looked at Saskatchewan and thought, good grief, is this the province I left 6, 7 years earlier? Albertans have a sense of entitlement. And it's not entitlement to anything else but the best. Because they deserve the best, they're Albertans. And you know where they got that from? Saskatchewan. You see, exactly 100 years ago, when that legislature was under construction, Walter Scott, the first premier of Saskatchewan, called this a big land for big people with big dreams. This was Canada's banner province. The next year, in 1911, we became the 3rd province in Canada. And from 1911 till the Second World War, the 3rd largest province in Canada was Saskatchewan. Those guys in Alberta were cranking along at 700,000. The British Columbians were at 750. We were at 931,000 people. And we were entitled to big. We were entitled to best because, damn it, we were Saskatchewan. So how does that happen? That you have 931 people in 1936, and in 1974, you have 920,000. The historians tell us, Saskatchewan never could recover from the Great Depression. Oh, we never could. Now, I could do my Pastor Lauren voice where I'd say, because if you have your ass hanging out of your dungarees, it's a wee province. So I've got Lauren Calvert talking about a wee province. I've got Lauren Calvert commemorating our entry into the have province status. And what does he do the day he makes the have province announcement? He announces Saskatchewan is now a have province. He pauses, his eyes lowered, he shuffles, there's a lump in his throat, and he says, We will always be in and out of have-not province status, my friends. Now, at the time, I thought that was like being in the Olympics when you're up on the gold medal podium and you get the person on the third level in a headlock and steal their bronze medal from them. You know, so imbued in this attitude, I write in the book, when coming home to host the radio show, I was struck time and time again by one inescapable fact. The Saskatchewan attitude really sucked. Everywhere I turned, it was there, an intricately woven web of inferiority, self-loathing, negativism, and pessimism. Like some movie zombie, shuffling along, sucking out the life and the hope of anybody in its way. Beyond being terribly depressing, this Saskatchewan attitude had become a big impediment to our collective psyche, even to our economic climate. Who would want to live in a place where people were just so down all the time? And this book, much more than the Calvert years, much more than the NDP fear, loathing, envy, attitude of low expectation, this book is about an attitude of getting back Walter Scott's Saskatchewan. And the book is really in three respects. It's a rant, and I apologize, I'm sort of in rant mode now. I know, it's a funny thing, I stand up, I have notes, I look out, open my mouth, and rants tumble out. It's been going on for years now, I apologize. So it's a rant, to be sure. But it's a lament. Because in the book on the population area, I talk about how all those provinces rebounded from the Great Depression. 700,000 in Alberta, today is nudging 4 million. The 400,000 in Manitoba is 1.2 million. You can go on every single province in the Dominion of Canada, look at the numbers in 37, you look at the numbers today, and the bad cases are 3 times multiplier. So even if we were a bad case, we'd be living in a province today of 2.97 million people. We're not a bad case. We are the worst case. Now, what did we do differently after the end of the Great Depression? I think you all know. We made certain policy choices politically that would govern us from 1944 till today, absent 19 years. So what I say in the book is there's a lot of attitudes that permeate this province. Maybe I told you a story before, but I laugh at this one all the time. I did so many speeches around the province on attitude, good and now the improving attitude, that I would pick up great stories. And in fact, the chapter in this on attitude was the most fun to write, because it was essentially taking a lot of speeches I've done and a lot of thoughts on attitude. But it's so hardwired in Saskatchewan. I met a guy from a small town. Not that old a guy. Started a small farm service business, and he grew it into a big one. And he's all over Saskatchewan, he's all over Western Canada, and he does very, very well. And he's like a lot of winners. In fact, in the book I have the Saskatchewan winner chart and the Saskatchewan whiner chart. And that chapter is Take That, Shane Lady. And this guy told me once, and it was the funniest thing, we were sitting around one night, I'd been speaking at a conference, and he and I went out for a drink later. I didn't know the guy. And he said, you know, when you talk about attitude and motivation, he said, it's pretty inspiring. He said, you know, I got a place in the States for years, I'm there a few months a year. He says, I get to do a lot of traveling. And he says, the funny part is when people ask you what you do and you start talking, and they figure out, you know, I'm running a pretty good business and I've got some good managers and good vice presidents, they say to me, you're doing okay. And I say, yeah, I'm doing okay. And they always say, good for you. Good for you. And he said, the more people would say good for you, it never clicked until I get back home. And I'd be talking about a new building we're building, a new plant expansion, and I'd be in Yorkton, and I'd be in Regina, and people would look at me and say, must be nice.